Hi, everyone, and thank you for selecting to um, join us for this module for Special Education for All Teachers, Part 1. And in this module, we will be exploring the evolution of disability rights and educational access in the United States by understanding the IDEA, which is the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, the ADA, which is the American Disabilities Act, and procedural safeguards. My name is Dr. Kristen Vogel Campbell. I am a credentialed special education teacher and special education administrator. And thank you again for joining us. Let's get started. So, first, we're going to talk about a brief history of special education in the United States. Free public schools in the United States began to take hold in the 1830s and became widespread in the 1850s and 1860s. However, public school systems did not allow disabled students from enrolling. Access to education for those with disabilities was heavily influenced by race, gender, and social status. As a result, most of those considered disabled were denied any formal education. Laurent Clerc and Thomas Hopkins Gallaudet formed the American Asylum for the Deaf, now known as the American School for the Deaf, the first disability-centered institution in Hartford, Connecticut in 1817. The Gallaudet family was also instrumental in the founding and recognition of the National Deaf-Mute College, which was later renamed Gallaudet University in 1864. So, special education law in the United States. The Elementary and Secondary Education Act, or ESEA, of 1965 provided funding for special education centers and improved educational opportunities for students with disabilities. Passed by President Johnson in 1965, ESEA was part of the President's War on Poverty. The law sought to allow equal access to a quality education. ESEA extended more funding to secondary and primary schools and emphasized high standards and accountability. This law was authorized as No Child Left Behind in 2001 under President Bush, then reauthorized as the Every Student Succeeds Act under President Obama in 2015. Before the passage of the Educational for All Handicapped Children Act in 1975, what we today refer to as the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, only 20% of children identified with a disability were attending public schools. There were some states that explicitly forbade students with disabilities from attending their home public school, as students with mental and physical disabilities were viewed as unsightly and a burden to schools. The majority of these students were sent to specialized state schools or were institutionalized. Families were encouraged by doctors at these institutions to never mention these children in order to preserve the sanctity of marriages and other children in the family. The EACHA was a game changer in that it required states to assess students for special education services and to provide those services in the least restrictive environment. It provided oversight and also provided partial federal funding for the development and implementation of these programs. However, this is important to note, to date, the federal government has never fully funded IDEA or special education programs, leaving these extra costs to states and districts. Now we're going to talk about civil rights laws in the United States. First, the Rehabilitation Act of 1973. This was the law that preceded IDEA of 1975. The Rehabilitation Act serves to protect the rights of people with disabilities in several ways. First, it protects people with disabilities against discrimination relating to employment. And Secondly, it provides students with disabilities equal access to the general education curriculum under Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act. And we'll talk a little bit more about Section 504 in a bit. The Americans with Disabilities Act of 1990 also protects the rights of people with disabilities. The ADA provides equal employment for people with disabilities. This means that employers must provide reasonable accommodations for people with disabilities in their job and work environments. It provides access for people with disabilities to both public and private places open to the public. For example, access ramps and automatic doors. It also provides telecommunication access to people with disabilities. This ensures that people with hearing and speech disabilities can communicate over the telephone and internet. So, Title III of the ADA prohibits discrimination against individuals with disabilities in public accommodations, ensuring equal access to public activities. Businesses that are open to the public, such as schools, restaurants, movie theaters, daycares, and recreation facilities, must comply with ADA standards. Similarly, commercial facilities, including privately owned businesses, factories, warehouses, and office buildings, are required to provide accessibility. This section of the ADA establishes general guidelines for reasonable modifications that businesses must implement, along with specific requirements for accommodations. It also mandates that new construction and building renovations adhere to ADA regulations. Additionally, Title III of the ADA, the Americans with Disabilities Act, outlines enforcement procedures detailing the consequences of discrimination and the certification process for state laws or local building codes. A state's assistant attorney general may certify that a public accommodation or commercial facility meets or exceeds Title III's minimum requirements. So, this is a photo from the Section 504 sit-in in 1977. The Section 504 sit-in was a disability rights protest that began on April 5th, 1977. People with disabilities and the disability community, with the aid and assistance of allied groups, occupied federal buildings in the United States in order to push the issuance of long-delayed regulations regarding Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973. 4 years later, those guidelines were not signed into law. The longest of the sit-ins was at the San Francisco Federal Building off of Market Street, which lasted for 26 days. Section 504 was the first federal law to prohibit discrimination against people with disabilities in programs and activities that receive federal funding. Again, prior to the 1990 enactment of the Americans with Disabilities Act, the Rehabilitation Act was the most important disability rights legislation in the United States. So the photo that you see on your screen is of Hale Zukas, Ron Washington, and Judy Heumann responding to questions at a press conference held at the San Francisco airport before those protesters left for Washington, D.C. And in the background, Lynette Taylor provides American Sign Language interpretation. This is a photo of the Capitol Crawl, which was in 1990. The Capitol Crawl was a pivotal disability rights protest that took place on March 12, 1990, in Washington, D.C. Activists, many of whom had disabilities, left behind their wheelchairs, crutches, and other mobility aids to crawl up the steps of the U.S. Capitol to demand the passage of the Americans with Disabilities Act, or ADA. So this protest was organized by ADAPT, a grassroots disability rights group. And it took place as part of the Wheels of Justice rally advocating for the ADA. Around 60 activists participated in the crawl. The one that you see here on two that you see here on your screen, one of the most notable participants was Jennifer Keelan, an 8-year-old girl with cerebral palsy who powerfully declared, "I'll take all night if I have to." And you can find a video of Jennifer as a grown-up in the additional resources at the end of this module. The protest highlighted the lack of accessibility in public spaces and urgency of passing the ADA. It was a turning point in disability rights advocacy, capturing media attention and pressuring Congress to act. Just 4 months later, on July 26, 1990, the Americans with Disabilities Act was signed into law by President George H.W. Bush. So the Capitol crawl remains a defining moment in disability activism, symbolizing the fight for equal rights and accessibility. So what is a Section 504 plan? So a Section 504 plan comes from the Civil Rights Law, Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973, and protects the rights of individuals with disabilities. A 504 plan is a formal plan or blueprint for how the school will provide services to a student with disability. This essentially removes barriers for individuals with disabilities by ensuring that appropriate services are provided to meet their special needs. A 504 plan includes accommodations. So a 504 plan includes accommodations a student with a disability may need to be successful in a regular education classroom. For example, a student with ADHD or attention hyperactivity disorder may need to sit near the front of the room to limit distractions. Related services. A 504 plan includes related services such as speech therapy or occupational therapy in order for that student to be successful in the general education classroom. However, and this is important to note, most students opt to have related services within the realm of special education and through an IEP. Finally, modifications. Although it is rare for a 504 plan to include modifications, sometimes they are included. Modifications change when the student is expected to do, such as being given fewer homework assignments. And now let's talk about the difference between an IEP and a 504 plan. So an IEP and a 504 plan are similar in that they serve as a blueprint for a student with a disability. However, as we just talked about, a 504 plan serves as a blueprint for how the student will have access to school, whereas the IEP serves as a blueprint for a student's special education services. A 504 plan helps level the playing field for a student with a disability by providing services and changes to the learning environment. An IEP provides individualized special education and related services to meet the unique needs of a student with a disability. Both IEPs and 504 plans are provided at no cost to parents. So the 504 plan was established under the Rehabilitation Act of 1973 as a civil rights law. The Individualized Education Plan was established under the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act in 1975 and then amended in 2004. Unlike an IEP, a 504 plan does not have to be a planned written document, although most districts and schools treat it as such. It's actually best practice for this to be a written document. An IEP is a planned written document that includes annual learning goals and describes related services for a student with a disability. Now we're going to talk a little bit about court cases related to special education and how court cases have helped shape the evolution of what special education services look like today. So the first one we're going to talk about is Diana versus the State Board of Education in 1970. So in 1970, the case of Diana versus State Board of Education, addressed the misplacement of Spanish-speaking students into classes for significantly intellectually disabled students based on culturally biased IQ tests administered in English. So, this court case mandated that students be assessed in their primary language or with nonverbal tests to ensure accurate placement. This case also highlighted the need for non-discriminatory assessments and influenced subsequent legislation, including the IDEA, which requires that evaluations be conducted in a child's native language to prevent misclassification. The second court case is the Pennsylvania Arc versus the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania in 1971. So in 1971, the Pennsylvania Arc or Park filed a class action lawsuit against the Commonwealth or state of Pennsylvania, challenging state laws that allow public schools to deny education to children with intellectual disabilities. Remember that 20% of students that are disabled were able to attend public schools before 1975. This was one of the court cases that challenged that and ultimately led to the passage of IDEA. The plaintiffs argued that this exclusion violated the equal protection and due process clauses of the 14th Amendment. The case resulted in a consent decree that declared the contested state laws unconstitutional. The court mandated that Pennsylvania provide free public education to all children with intellectual disabilities, ages 6 through 21, that were tailored to their learning capacities. Additionally, the decree established that placement in regular public school classes was preferable, emphasizing the principle of the least restrictive environment. This landmark decision affirmed that all children, regardless of disability, are entitled to a free public education, influencing subsequent legislation such as the EAHCA in 1975, which we know as the IDEA. The third case that we're going to talk about is Larry P. Riles, which was a court case in 1979. In this case, the United States District Court for Northern California ruled that the use of standardized IQ tests to place African American students into classes for the intellectually disabled was discriminatory. The court found that these tests culturally biased and not validated for such placements, leading to the disproportionate assignment of African American children to these classes. As a result, the court issued a permanent injunction prohibiting California school districts from using standardized IQ tests for the identification and placement of African American students into intellectually disabled classrooms without prior court approval. Additionally, the court mandated the reevaluation of African American students who were previously placed in such classes, excluding the use of standardized intelligence tests, and required the monitoring and elimination of disproportionate representation of African American students in these placements. This decision underscored the necessity for non-discriminatory assessment tools in educational settings and influenced subsequent policies to ensure fair evaluation practices for all students. And this law is still current today. So when you have an African American student who is being evaluated for special education, standardized IQ tests are not permitted to be used. The fourth case that we're going to talk about is Sacramento City Unified versus Rachel H., which was a 1994 case. In this case, the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Ninth Circuit addressed the appropriate educational placement for Rachel Holland, an 11-year-old student with an intellectual disability and an IQ of 44. The court upheld the district court's decision to place Rachel full-time in a regular classroom with supplementary services emphasizing the importance of mainstreaming under the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. So what's important about this case is the court applied a four-factor test to determine the sustainability of mainstreaming Rachel. And those four factors are used in many, if not most, court cases about special education services today. So these four factors are educational benefit. So Rachel demonstrated academic progress in a regular classroom setting, benefiting from imitation and modeling behaviors from her teacher and her peers. Non-academic benefits. Rachel's social and communication skills improved through interaction with non-disabled peers, enhancing her self-confidence. The third factor is the effect on others. Rachel was well behaved and did not disrupt the classroom. Her presence did not negatively impact the teacher's ability to instruct other students. And finally, cost. The district's projected costs for mainstreaming Rachel were found to be overstated, meaning that they projected that those costs were significantly higher than they actually were. The court determined that providing necessary support services in a regular classroom would not impose undue financial burden to the district. So the Supreme Court declined to review the case on June 13th, 1994, which effectively affirmed the Ninth Circuit's ruling. This decision reinforced the IDEA's preference for educating students with disabilities alongside their non-disabled peers to the maximum extent appropriate, promoting inclusivity and equal educational opportunities. The fifth court case that we're going to discuss is Honig versus Doe, and this is from 1998. The U.S. Supreme Court addressed the disciplinary rights of students with disabilities under the EAHCA, which is now again known as the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. The court ruled that schools cannot unilaterally suspend or expel students with disabilities for behaviors related to their disabilities beyond 10 days without violating the stay put provisions of the IDEA. This provision mandates that a child remaining in their current educational placement during the pendency of any proceedings, unless the parents and the state agree otherwise. So students have a right to remain in their current placement while alternative placements are being evaluated. The court also emphasized that if maintaining the current placement is substantially likely to result in injury to the student or others, school officials may seek a court order to temporarily remove the student from school, but they need to seek that court order before removing the student. And finally, the court affirmed that the state must provide services directly to students with disabilities when local school boards fail to do so. This decision underscored the importance of protecting the educational rights of students with disabilities, ensuring that they are not unjustly excluded from the classroom due to behaviors arising from their disability. And finally, the most recent court case that we're going to discuss is DR versus Redondo Beach Unified School District, which was ruled in 2022. The Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals addressed the educational placement of DR, a student with autism. The court evaluated whether the school district's proposed IEP, which recommended increasing DR's time in a special education classroom, complied with the IDEA mandate for the least restrictive environment. So the court used the four-factor test from Rachel H., and the Ninth Circuit concluded that the school district's proposed IEP violated the least restrictive environment. However, the court denied the parents' request for reimbursement for private educational services and concluded that they did not demonstrate that the alternative private placement was appropriate under IDEA. So, this decision underscores the IDEA's preference for educating students with disabilities alongside their non disabled peers to the maximum extent appropriate, similar to Rachel H. And it focused on individual programs rather than comparison to grade level standards. So, now let's talk about the 6 major provisions to the IDEA. Remember that the IDEA is the federal law that was first enacted in 1975, only 50 years ago, that made it mandatory for public schools to enroll and teach students with disabilities. So, first, a free, appropriate public education, and the acronym FAPE is used pretty frequently. So, under the IDEA, every child with a disability is entitled to a free, appropriate public education. The IDEA emphasizes special education and related services, which should be designed to meet a child's unique needs and prepare them for further education, employment, and independent living. Furthermore, courts have held that the IDEA requires schools to prepare IEPs, which confer meaningful educational benefit to children with disabilities. The meaningful educational benefit requirement includes a focus on raised student expectations, appropriate progress, and transition into post-secondary education and independent living. Public schools and local school boards are responsible for ensuring that every child with a disability receives a free, appropriate public education. Appropriate evaluation. The IDEA requires that schools conduct appropriate evaluations of students who are suspected of having a disability. An appropriate evaluation must be implemented by a team of knowledgeable and trained evaluators, must utilize sound evaluation materials and procedures, and must be administered on a non-discriminatory basis. And we talked about some of those court cases that redefined what non-discriminatory basis means. Children should not be subjected to unnecessary assessments or testing, and evaluations must be geared toward planning for the child's education and future instruction. Finally, an appropriate evaluation must determine and make recommendations regarding a child's eligibility for special education services in a timely manner. Next, we have the Individualized Education Plan, or IEP. The IEP was established by the IDEA to help ensure every child's access to a free, appropriate public education. The IEP is a written document developed by an IEP team, which draws upon existing evaluation information in order to meet a student's unique educational needs. Under the IDEA, an IEP must include information regarding a student's present levels of educational performance. It must include annual goals and benchmarking objectives. It must include services and supplementary aids to be received, and a detailed explanation of times where a student is not participating in general education and why. An IEP is also required to include information regarding consistent reporting on student progress, as well as transition to adult life. Finally, it is required that an IEP account for the planning concerns of the parents and the child, the strengths of a particular child, and the specific academic, developmental, and functional needs of the child. The IDEA places a strong emphasis on placement in a general education setting. Under the IDEA, a student is guaranteed placement in the least restrictive environment possible. Therefore, an IEP team must explore a number of alternatives for enabling a student to participate in the general education classroom. These may include classroom modifications, supplemental aids and services, alternative instructional methods, among other things. If an IEP team determines that a student cannot be satisfactorily educated in a general education setting, then the team must make responsible efforts to determine the LRE for that student outside of the general education classroom. Parent participation. The IDEA has a special provision for parent participation in placement decisions. Under this provision, state educational agencies and local school boards must ensure that the parents of a child with a disability are members of any group that make decisions regarding the placement and LRE of that child. Parents have the right to equal participation in this process and are entitled to notification of a planned evaluation, access to planning and evaluation materials, and involvement in all meetings regarding their child's placement. Additionally, parents retain the right to refuse further evaluations of their child. Both students and parents must be invited to IEP meetings, and the IDEA explicitly establishes a role for the parent as equal participant and decision maker. So, as a special education teacher and administrator, having a student attend their own IEP meeting, even from third grade on, is an extremely empowering experience for that student. Having them understand the process, as well as having them understand their own goals, and having them be part of that decision-making process is critical. Finally, the IDEA establishes procedural safeguards to help parents and students enforce their rights under federal law. The primary purpose of this requirement is twofold. Safeguards protect parental access to information pertaining to placement and transition planning, and procedures are put in place to resolve disagreements between parents and schools regarding the placement of a student. Under the procedural safeguards, parents have a right to review all educational records pertaining to their child, receive notice prior to meetings about their child's evaluation, placement, or identification, and to obtain an independent educational evaluation, or IEE, for consideration at such meetings. If disagreements arise, parents have the right to request mediation or due process hearings with state-level education agencies, and beyond that, may appeal the decision in state or federal court. So that concludes the lecture on Module 1. And your next steps are to go into the module in Canvas and to look at the next assignment, which is to review an article about the readability of the procedural safeguards and how that might create barriers for some of our families. I hope that this was super informative for you, and I hope that you continue your journey along these modules of special education for all teachers. Thank you.